interesting. We have been exploring ideas about place and history, time, and also space, and how to connect that with artistic agency versus artistic intention. So today we're going to begin unpacking the idea of place in a very complex and profound way. The four readings that we assigned for this week were enhancement or distortion, horror on the grand tour, the nakedness of America, and the imaginary Orient. So let's begin with the reading on enhancement or distortion, which compares ideas about Instagram and the cloud glass from the late 18th century and early 19th century. So what are your thoughts on this reading? What did you find in this specific reading? Who wants to go first? And one of the things that I want you guys to think about is we are going to be discussing the practices of mediation. And of course, it's Instagram and the cloud glass and the picturesque and landscape have had a long tradition. And if you remember in the reading, there's two quotes that are compared. One from Scape Tone in 2012, and the other one from John Ruskin, and they are separated from 150 years. They are similar, but they are apart 150 years. So what are your thoughts on this?
I had just a quick thought.
Yes.
So I do have the John Ruskin quote, and I mean, I think it's funny that every time that there's a new tool, there's going to be a new tool for artistic expression. There's going to be people who are saying, "Oh, it's ruining art," which is one of the things that I pulled out from that article is that new tools encourage and strengthen some practices. It can also numb a practice. So it's I think what it's trying to say is it's how it gets used, whether you're in control of it or it's in control of you. And then that's all I have.
Right. And I want us to begin exploring what you just said. What does it mean to ruin art? What is it ruining? Because it does talk about the experience of art. So when we think about ruining the experience of art, what are these two technologies in the mind of these critics creating or presenting as a problem?
They're like ruining modernity as we know it, or like the ideas of art
Sort of
created by like European I don't know the right words, but like European standards of art.
Yes, and more than anything, they're ruining the experience of the authentic in the mind of these two critics. However, these technologies are also emphasizing the technology in itself to create the idea of the authentic. So they are being used to mediate, and we know that space and um, time cannot be mediated. So what is happening when we say they are being mediated? They are actually mediating. Yes, I am.
When you try to mediate the time and the space, you are creating a fiction, an invention.
What kind of fiction?
Fiction, I don't understand in this way, like a personal fiction.
Yes, it's a fiction of the experience, which is personal, and it's rooted in the I think, therefore I am. It's the same Cartesian invention, and this fiction is connected to several terms: landscape, landscape representation, and picturesque, and this idea of how we can distort space into place. So why do I bring up picturesque and landscape? How are these two functioning in terms of experience, in terms of performance?
Hi. Hi. Hello.
Hola,
Hola,
Mariana.
Mariana.
Hola. Well, I think that those two concepts are like really focusing on the idea of objectivizing, like making an object of the other or from the other. So, with this idea of mediation, I think that we allow the romanticization of the experience of interaction between each other. So with that term, with
Mhm.
mediation, we can mild like the idea of the interaction creating conflict or creating a friction. And I think that it's a powerful tool to control that relationship. And considering landscape and authentic and what is original or not, or what is picturesque or not, we can emphasize that romanticization of the relationship. That's why in this reading, especially, this, these two considerations are important because you can decide if you can make the other person an object or not. If you can turn the landscape into a landscape instead of a space. So
Mhm.
you are like materializing in some way
Mhm.
your desire of converting those things into objects or the people into objects. And for example, what is talking about people, if you see a picture of someone wearing a huipil on Instagram, it's usually performed as a process of objectivation. So I think that is like the main core of this reading, like how these
Yes.
tools make you able to perform others as an object.
Right. Right. And it's impossible to turn anyone into something else.
Mm.
So this is why, as Mariana is explaining, it's precisely why this is a fiction and is an invention of distortion. And I want to read you this quote that Kirsten Buick gave in an interview. Um, and if you're interested, I can also post this interview on the classroom. One of the ways you have to understand landscape is that it erases as much as it reveals. Landscape representation, especially US landscape representation, and I would extend this to into Mexican landscape, Latin American landscape, most traditions because of the 19th century and nationalism use landscape representation. So, and she continues, inherently is an eraser of Indian, quote unquote, extermination and the exploitation of African labor on that land. So landscape and empire are automatically implicated. So this is how we begin to understand how the idea of landscape is actually not the environment, it's not community, it's not what you see. It's actually the spatialization of thought. That's what how we invent place. Mhm. And the picturesque, just like Mariana was explaining, it creates this fiction and it also allows us to imagine that we can distance ourselves from what we're seeing and remain untouched, unaltered. And one of the things that we know is that with every encounter, and because of movement, and because of space and time being relationships, we never remain the same. We're always being changed. Hmm? What other thoughts do you have on this reading?
Casey.
Casey, yes.
It was more so a question about maybe clarifying something, but I felt like we've been kind of talking about or criticizing like landscape and picturesque, and I'm kind of following that. But then there's that separate argument of against like filtration and using of filters. I was just wondering if you could explain, are those separated, or are we more so trying to like combine the argument against filtration and filters within that argument of landscape and picturesque?
How would you define filtering?
I mean, I'm thinking of filtering as like how they're talking about the different types of filters you can use on Instagram, and then also the 18th century glass that
Right.
changes or distorts the photo or whatever's behind it. So possibly a distortion.
Right. And would it be possible to have or to produce an image that is not filtered?
An image, no, probably not.
Exactly. So this also relates to the question that Victoria is asking. What is the difference between distortion and technique? And what we have to think about is how ideology is creating a distortion, meaning imagining that time can become history, or it's actually history, that history is time, when in fact it's not. It's just one narrative in many possibilities of narratives. And also how space is distorted into place. Now, this is not the argument of saying, should we use or not use filters? Anything we do is filtered. Even if I take a photo with my phone without looking, it's already filtered. It's already rooted in the problem of photography and its relationship with history and the problematic implications of the image. If I decide to paint the sky, it's filtered. So there's no option of creating images without filters. Now, what we need to think about is the function of this enhancement or distortion. And one of the things that we need to think about is how the practice of mediation, because we're always mediating, could actually be used to again mediate ideology, or to again challenge ideology. Not mediate reality, but actually negotiate or challenge ideology. So it can be used. Distortion, we are going to be thinking about it in two possibilities, or in two, not possibilities, in two, in relation with the process of seeing. The first distortion is knowing that time and space cannot be altered, yet we imagine they can be distorted into history and place. But then we begin thinking about distortion as a possibility to correct the initial distortion that happened. And in that sense, in the reading about America, I found a really interesting paragraph that we'll talk about, because that explains in a very interesting way the possibility of one technique that can be used to correct this distortion. Any other questions at this point? Any other comments at this point? Okay, we're going to, oh yes, Taylor.
Yeah, I haven't, this is more of a comment really, but I was looking at the date of this article and thinking about how the article hasn't taken into account new updates and how certain stories these days. And Instagram itself even wants to use stories so bad. They prioritize it in the feed, they prioritize it in the algorithm for engagement, all that stuff. And I just think that's an interesting choice of words. So they're calling it story, implying that there's narrative, like telling and that kind of thing. So I thought that was interesting to consider with this article.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Because these technology, what is fascinating is that both of the critics that criticize these technologies had a point. They miss some of the points because it's not really how this technology is going to be replaced with the new horrible thing, because in essence, what made Instagram so relevant is that it's rooted in a tradition of imagining that distortion, that idea of, and that we're going to unpack actually when we get to the nakedness of America, because it's imagining time versus place as a as a as an invention. So we will think about how these technologies actually create a problem for everyone. They do, and it's not, the point is not to use them. It doesn't exempt whether we use them or not. It's the same question as should we create or not create. There's no option. These are problems that are larger than our life, and what we need to think about is how we address technique in the process of understanding the questions that we want to perform or make the viewer perform. Mhm. Mark, I think you had a question. I wasn't able to read it as fast as it was shown. Can you share that question with everyone?
Can you hear now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I was listening to the question about distortion and technique. I came in late because I've been hit with an idea this morning that I'm working on, and it has to do with setting type, and setting type for the word desperado, which it turns out comes from the Latin for being desperate.
Mhm.
And I see it as a setting this type as kind of a technique to a desire to distort or make a story.
Mhm.
So what is the relationship between the printed word and the issue about technique as opposed to distortion, or technique and distortion?
Yes, I think it's a very relevant question because the technology of printed word is actually how capitalism takes uh, a new step in the idea of progress. So it is very much connected to money. It is very much connected to books. However, the technique of printing, it's it's uh, it's more, it has many more resources in that sense. So what we think, it's an interesting question when we think about how we use technique, because again, the point is not to decide what techniques are the ones that are useful or more than useful, they are appropriate or positive or the right choice, but it's actually how we use the technique in context to its history. And just like I was reading in the quote by Kirsten Buick, to imagine that landscape is a pure form of image, because we had an experience, for instance, in Peru, which all of the Peruvian narrative, or most of the Peruvian narrative, even by their own board of tourism, is about landscape. And to think about it is disconnected from the idea of extermination, and how nations were able to take on space and eventually create place as a nation. It's impossible. So the question here is, how do we think about the technique as a possibility for distortion? Not distortion in the sense of time and actually of history and place, but to distort it again into time and space. And I will upload the reading on printed capitalism, which is the introduction to the book Imagine Community. So I'll include that. Any other questions or comments at this point? Okay, we're going to connect it now with the horror on the Grand Tour. What do you find in this reading? What is it talking about? What is the Grand Tour, first of all? Why is the Grand Tour relevant to all of us, specifically thinking about residencies?
Well, the Grand Tour in relationship to horror, if we're looking at what is horror, Julie Kristeva on The Powers of Horror breaks it down into trying to separate ourselves from the abject, which would be like any of the things that we try to keep internal. The abject is also like a denial of our own like human body in a lot of ways, because we produce blood, we eliminate, et cetera, et cetera. But it is also like a fear of a border sort of disintegrating. And so I think in terms of the Grand Tour, the way that they describe like the statues of Saint Bartholomew in such like a removed way, like a clinical way, and so that's like the denial of the body. But on the Grand Tour, it is saying, oh, the Romans really enjoy the gladiator fights, but their enjoyment is implicit as well, but they find that need to separate. And so like horror and the Grand Tour of experiencing other cultures is to, there's an element of voyeurism in that, I think.
Yes.
But also, of course, imperialism is implied in that as well. Like, we cannot be part of this community. We are going to judge this community.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to connect that that thought with the imaginary orient in when we move to that reading. And it's precisely as you're saying, Sandra, is this idea of the authority based on a claim to personal experience of travel. And it's fascinating because for many, many years, scholars have been looking at Baroque art as an expression that is unique from the Americas, because it's the Baroque in the Americas is very different from the rest of the world. And they would define it as horror vacui. And when I read, and this is the horror of empty space. And of course, this is a derogatory term that has been used in the tradition of continental Europe to imagine distance and difference, just like, for instance, when we think about surrealism in the Americas is magical surrealism. It's not surrealism in the same sense as the French. It's always, even when we think about the tradition of eating human flesh, one is cannibalism and another one is the tradition of eating in Europe, anthropophagia. Yes. So this term horror vacui, I didn't think about it until now, and this is meaning the term horror is linked to the experience of traveling, and that is fascinating because it cannot be separated from place. Christian, do you have a question? Well, he'll come back. So yes, and it's interesting to think about how the Grand Tour has informed all of the experiences that we think about, because it is the process of romanticizing movement. It is imagining that you can move through time while everything it remains in place. But it's also how we read art today. It is in this reading we also see how art in the context of traveling has a very long tradition in the ways in which we see. So this is also why we visit museums. This is also why we visit art when we travel. This is why we see and we travel into specific places. And I always, I'm thinking of challenging the Grand Tour, or actually Residencies, as an invention of place in relation to the Grand Tour, because it's a narrative that has been hidden. It has been erased somehow. So it's interesting to rethink And this is something that we've been thinking about for at least 10 years. How could we rethink residencies? And not that residencies will disappear in the sense of encountering and seeing each other again in person. But I think, as Mark was saying last week, this possibility of rethinking our practice as a relationship, as we're doing today in our homes, it creates a new possibility for us to think about other narratives about history and actually not history, space and time. Other thoughts or questions on the horror on the Grand Tour?
I had one.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Hello,
it re-
Denise.
Hi. It reminded me of the timeline that was in the Amparo Museum in Puebla.
Uh-huh.
In the
Yes.
timeline, it's simplistic in that it is this is what happened here at this time and at this place, but it's pure because it doesn't have the pompous art history sentences and interpretations of the critics that takes you away from experiencing the art. And I felt like the horror for me is then our disengagement with reading the artworks or folk art or the object, and more concentration on the blurbs or the pontification of how you're supposed to um, think, how you're supposed to feel. As a teacher of art history, former teacher of art history, but not an art historian at all, the narrative was easy to teach, but it shouldn't, because it engaged the student, but it shouldn't become the answer, the overall answer. Like I wanted to engage them in the object, but I didn't want them to, necessarily remember all the gossipy details or rumors or eroticism or, whatever else that is filled in with all of that grand tour or Baroque painting that we have. So I'd like that timeline in that it was based on fact rather than theory. And it gave you the responsibility to make the connection of the places. And I think that responsibility is one of the reasons why I travel, why I do these residencies, why I look to where I'm at or try to experience where I'm at. In relationship to Peru, it's totally landscape for me as an experience. And I don't think that Peru will ever change, or certainly Cusco won't ever change out of that whole experience of land and geography, in my opinion.
Yes, thank you, Denise. The key, as you're mentioning, is how we read,
Mhm.
because this idea of how images are transparent in how the reading is also framing it's really impossible. So although in the timeline of the Amparo Museum, and this is also why museums are vicious places, and we have to rethink them, because for instance, one of the things that this timeline fails to convey is that that timeline isn't actually an attitude towards the work of art. So he's telling us how to read it as opposed to letting us read whatever we encounter. And as you're saying, it's the process of reading that is key. Because when we approach any work of art, there is much more than the narrative of progress that has been invented. So for instance, when we think about the Sistine Chapel in relation to Tenochtitlan, how could we even relate to the murals that were produced in Tenochtitlan in relation to the Sistine Chapel if we have been already trained to have specific attitudes towards perspective and scale and color and specific ways of reading. So what is interesting is when we travel, we have to figure out a way to understand the relationship that we're performing, because there's not any true meaning to anything. There's no essence. It's actually the possibility of time and space that can create knowledge in that process of encounter. Mhm.
I think too, it tells you what you have, and not just how you have to read it, but what you have to read. And that's interesting in itself, because it there are so many other things that aren't in our history books
Mhm.
and are equally as impressive or powerful or important,
Right.
whatever, criteria you want to put on those. And sometimes I look at that and I'm thinking, well, that's not in my history book, like
Mhm.
that's not in my lecture.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
so that's another reason why travel, or my own grand tour is important, for that.
Yes, and this also relates to some of the aspects that Linda Nochlin talks about in the reading The Imaginary Orient. How, for instance, timelines become this idea of the reality effect, and once we see how it's an effect, then the more we see it's a technology that it's invented, as you're saying, to make us read in specific ways, as opposed to allow ourselves to find or to encounter new possibilities of knowledge. Mhm. Yes, thank you, Denise. So, any other comments on the reading uh, Horror on the Grand Tour?
I just have a quick question.
Yes.
Uh, so to me, the reading. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Christian. Go ahead. I've already talked.
No, no, go ahead, Rusty, and then Christian
Okay.
will
Well, no.
yeah.
So to me, I thought how I read the article is that the Grand Tour took place almost exclusively in Italy. It was people from other parts of Europe going to Italy and experiencing all of the Roman Catholic art, like the paintings of the saints. So I was wondering if there's some sort of relationship with Catholicism and how things are supposed to be read in a horrific way.
Yes.
And then also, and this may be like skipping ahead in the reading to make a connection, but kind of the development of horror as an attitude towards the paintings seems like a kind of like a sublimation of the viewer's erotic or sadistic desires, which is going to kind of mean that the exchange of artwork between the producer and the consumer is we're both repressing our worst instincts, and here's the product. So yeah, if what is the role of Catholicism and the attitude towards that specifically is, I think, my main question.
Right. Well, first of all, the Grand Tour had different moments, and it's actually interrupted during the French Revolution in the way it was invented by the British Empire, and because it was reserved for politicians and higher classes, but it becomes a way of seeing. So although it culminated in Italy, it eventually not only included your other European cities, but it also included um, the Middle East. And remember that Middle East is also an invention through Orientalism. It included the holy, quote unquote, holy places or holy sites. So Jerusalem and Bethlehem. But it also encompassed this idea of seeing that eventually also reaches the Americas. It is, and we're going to get to the Americas in the reading about America, which is it's wonderful. But yes, and I think, and probably Sandra has more to say about this, but horror is also connected to the experience of cinema, and how we also invent plays and in history, because cinema is also that possibility of moving without moving and creating ideas about histories and narratives that we normalize even without thinking about them. And yes, not necessarily the Catholic religion, but Catholic visual culture has a very profound effect in the ways we read, in the ways we understand. And it varies in different moments. It varies on in place where we grew up, and how we grew up, and how we familiarize. I had no idea how trained we are, for instance, in Puebla, to read churches, even without understanding what it means. But it's so because I haven't been to mass for with the intention of being part of the mass for many years. But it is automatic when you enter place, you're put in place, and it's very easy to fall into the traps of following the process of repeating and seeing and participating without your consent. Yes, Christian, you had a question or a comment.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hey. Yeah. I have a little problem with my microphone now. Yeah. Back in what Denise was saying, and when you were saying about the traveling and the distortion of the whole experience, I think that is about when you go into to this whole experience, and then part of it of the nature and the landscape and and then it's the expectations, how expectations are part of this equation of the experience and the read that you got when you got there by having I don't know, like a previous fall. You got like this expectation and how everything when you go in this place of this landscape that you got in your head, how that worked, how those expectations got into the equation. That was a kind of my question on my phone.
Yes, because it is intertwined with desire. I was reading another text about the Grand Tour, and it was explaining. Well, I found really several interesting connections that I'll share with you. The first one is that Goethe's book on his travel through Italy is directly connected with that horrific book on Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth, whatever her last name is. It is connected, and she's actually reading that book in the process of her travels. And there's a wonderful essay that talks about that relationship that I'll try to find for you guys. But this idea of finding your true self in relation to traveling, it is something that has been reformatted. On the other, and you were asking about expectation. Yes, and another quote that I found that is really really interesting is that uh, there's in one of these essays there's a quote on one tourist who went to Las Vegas, and she said that it was her experience of seeing David, the Michelangelo's sculpture. It was much better in Vegas than actually in Italy, because it was first of all it was cleaner and it had air conditioning. So this is a way of seeing that is rooted in how we behave, and expectation and desire is intertwined. Another of the funny quotes that I found is that some Chinese travelers going to Paris were horrified by the scene of the subway being crowded and dog shit everywhere, when they thought Paris was going to be their set for their own romantic movie. So it is the way, and in that sense, the idea of traveling cannot be separated from authenticity, and the idea that we will find the authentic anything is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So now let's connect with the next reading, "The Nakedness of America," which is it's a fascinating reading. It has so many layers and so many interesting and complex issues. And it is a reading that talks about this specific print that is connected to the idea of place and is invented as place. What do you guys find in this reading? And it begins with the apparent opposition between discoverer and discovered.
Yeah, that's what I found. One of the things I found interesting. It reminded me of when I was in Puebla, and I believe it was Miguel. No, I can't remember. It was the guest lecturer. He does the podcast Latinos at Lunch.
Oh, Dr. Emanuel Ortega.
Yes, yes,
Yes.
there. And we went to one of these Franciscan churches.
Mhm.
Yeah, comments and talking about how there was this narrative of like the natives as these monstrous like beings and all these assumptions, and that relationship between discovered and discoverer. That's what it was reminding me of when reading about the very same thing in America.
Yes, and we see this image that is divided in two as opposite, with also very interesting connections. And the first things that we notice is that the entering ship symbolizes the course of history, and the stage that we see is also the naturalness of America. And we see the contrast between Vespucci as an individual historical figure and also America as an abstract. And this is very important to think about because the power of images is always in relation to the legacy of history. It cannot be separated, whether we want it or not. It's always with the legacy of history. This is how place is invented, how organizing principles invent place. And we see how the course of history, which I think about, or I frame it in terms of progress, it's against or opposite to the naturalness. And from this, many problems emerge from gender, imagining that women do this and men do that, from class, from race. It is a perfect image to begin thinking about this idea of ideological distortions. What else did you guys find in this reading? Thank you, Taylor.
Well, just right after what you were talking about, I was kind of struck by what the article says: the emergence of America marks its loss of identity because once it was discovered, it becomes merely a naked body for Europe to project desire.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, absolutely. And in that sense, I relate it to this specific quote. The traces of epistemological, moral, and aesthetic agencies disappear under the spell of a lifelike representation. And this also relates to the reading, The Imaginary Orient. We're going to use that one to round up the whole argument. Mm-hmm. So what else did you guys find in this reading?
Also, I think that another thing that is important, that it's also related to the imaginary orient, is the process of creating antagonism. And antagonism as the complete opposite figure of what is supposed to be modern or Western or white or male female, like creating these distortions that take us to completely opposite sides. That's one of the things that I think can be also like the core of the analysis, is that this creation, like for example, the discoverer and the discovered, like the person that is discovering and the other one that is discovered, it's also like a process of distortion that creates opposites.
Yes, and this is a very important point because this is when we know Europe doesn't exist. because it can only exist if America exists as the opposite. This is also why the Renaissance cannot exist without the Americas. This is why, and I find this quote really interesting. The essence and destiny of Europe is symbolized by the historical actor, whereas the American continent is confined to a series of separate individual representatives wandering without direction or meaning, thus reduced to the context of a European abstraction of the New World. Europe cannot exist with the Americas cannot exist without Europe. Both places should not exist because they are both inventions and they are contingent to that relationship. And this is why when we see, for instance, going back to the moment in history, in this forced narrative that we are experiencing today, when we look at how Europe has been treating information about the virus in comparison to information that is how the virus is treated in the Americas, it cannot be separated from this. The civilized versus the natural, and you're going to find all these narratives intertwined in the news, in descriptions, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And yes, the problem is how the explorer is transformed into a proto-scientist. And this is how place is the spatialization of thought. And I want us to take a moment to think about this. Spatialization of thought. Who could give me an example of that? What do we mean when we say the spatialization of thought? First of all, where did I find this from, or how do I relate this to the reading?
Because purgatory is the spatialization of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And that's again in Catholic theology from the, I didn't write down the century, but I think like 17th maybe. But yeah, so that was the creation of purgatory, which is entirely an exercise in thought.
Yes, exactly. And other examples of spatialization of thought would be race, would be class, would be gender. For instance, home. So, for instance, cannibalism will always be the historical gap separating the old and the new world. The Caribbean is another spatialization of thought. And this is not necessarily, this is how we have to think about technique all the time. And this goes back to the question that Victoria was asking. There is no techniques that are evil. It's the way in which we use them, or we are being used by the legacy of history.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
You hear me? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is spatialization of thought essentially, is it essentially another way of saying inventing all these kinds of concepts and making them into like a, is it like a neater way of saying, of explaining concepts like race and gender and putting it into a physical form?
Yes, it's another fancy way to say how we invent place.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And I wonder if, sorry, I was making coffee. I didn't want to be distracting in the background moving around. But thinking about like if you have place, then you can conquer it, right? So is that maybe a connection here too? Is like if we take something from the abstract and we try to define it and turn it into space or or landscape or things like that, then you can own it, you can conquer it, you can, or you can try at least.
Yes, yes, and this is one of the realities that we have to face when we think about the conquest. For instance, during the quarantine period in Peru, uh, everyone was banned from going into the streets and going into, outside of their houses, outside of their homes. And the reality is that there's a long-lasting tradition in Peru of understanding space through relationships and through geographical position in relation to others. So the idea of preventing people from moving outside of their home was impossible because there are so many Inca trails going into so many directions that the police cannot control, that people were able to get to their homes, to buy things, to exchange things, and not necessarily to put themselves at risk. This is a way of understanding space that has been contesting the dominant narrative since the beginning of the conquest. This is why we need to understand that since the moment of the conquest, there has been resistance, because one of the big challenges that Europeans or the conquerors found in the Americas was this impossibility of controlling. And one of the things that we see is that, for instance, the Spanish Empire didn't have an army big enough to control the population. So they had to invent these strategies. And this is also how, not necessarily as a clever strategy that they found, but it's the progress of these ideas of extermination that eventually became maps and eventually became inventing places and eventually lead to the beginning of nations. So yes, it is how we commodify, and this is how we control. Mhm. I also want to pay attention to the paragraph that talks about paradox. What did you guys find in the paragraph about paradox in the Nakedness of America? And I'm pulling it up so that we can use some of the quotes. Why do you think I would say that paradox could be a useful technique for distortion? And this article is this essay is very dense. It's wonderful because it expands into so many possibilities and it has so many layers of knowledge. So this is one of those articles that are very useful in many levels. So we should go back to this article again and again to understand how places are invented, but also how techniques function, because there's something about artistic agency that is interesting in the reading. What did you guys find? Yes.
I'll take a stab at it. So as I look at the paragraph, I guess it's making me think about how what we see as a paradox is sort of when two kind of concepts that seem to be at odds are somehow going together. And I think that if you see those things as being at odds or as different from one another, or if you see those things as kind of not some sort of irony in the way they go together, then I think that sort of reifies your idea that they are in fact different. I think there's something in there about that.
Yes, the image is full of problems. That's we understand that, and the point that you're making is key to understand how paradox could function to understand an open-ended possibility to read the image, and how it is trying to define within the constraints of the image in itself or the concept in itself, but at the same time is opening the possibility to understanding beyond what you're actually seeing. And I want to read the quote on paradox that Rabasa is using by Rosalie Colley. The very infiniteness of paradox, its open-endedness, is balanced by its tautology. For all paradoxes, especially those of self-reference, are self-enclosed statements with no external reference point from which to take a bearing upon paradox itself. Self-limited, they deny limitation. And that's an interesting way to start thinking about work and how to start thinking about distortion as a possibility of a technique. If open-endedness and closure coexist in paradox, then we may trace at least two possible readings of the paradoxes in general. One would merely repeat its tautology, the other would seek to understand how self-limitation, the absence of external reference, denies limitation. And this is also not trying to romanticize that images can actually not have external references, but it is a possibility to think how the technique could actually crack the image open to allow negotiations in that sense in the history of that technique. Thoughts and comments on this?
I had something to add. Can you guys
Yes,
hear me?
Lindsay.
Yeah, my camera,
Yeah.
my internet's not so great today, so I have the camera off. But something that was kind of jumping out to me was just the process of printmaking in general. As a printmaker, you know, those things definitely stick with me. But I liked how it was described. Like, so, you know, when you make a print and say you want text, you have to write it backwards. All these descriptions about them changing it, like it was almost like, was this just an accident or was this intentional? And you could really look at it both ways. And then this language of old world meets new world, like printmaking is this sort of historical process. And just looking at the plate, like they use the word mirror a lot, you know, and seeing this as this reflection, and a mirror is really unreliable. And so is a print, because that print is made with this perspective that we can't lose, even if we try, you know? So I guess just noticing how the printing process, you know, kind of relates, I guess. Something else, you know, is that the information kind of can try to be erased from the plate, but it still remains. You can still find evidence of it.
Mhm.
So even as you're trying to scrape the plate down, the history is still there. So I think that just relating to the technique and the paradox, I found interesting.
Absolutely, absolutely. This idea of the mirror and sort of the accident or the intention, and this is when we know intention doesn't matter. What remains is artistic agency, because the artist's intention is not necessarily there, but intention, and in the end, it makes us question, because it makes us understand that we're actually reading the images, and that the artist is also aware of that. So it makes us try to figure out, are we reading it? Are we participating in it? Changing the image to challenge the idea of the reality effect is precisely that. And I want to read a short quote on one of the essays that I will include on the next batch of, in the next group of readings. And it's an essay written by Dr. Kirsten Buick, and it's the ideal works of Edmonia Lewis. And she says, Lewis remains a presence that is absent in her work. She is present as an artist, as the creator of art, but she is absent as the subject or object of her art. And this relates to the questions that we are thinking about in terms of our work. We need to remain present as a creator. And this relates to what Lindsay was saying. If we invert the way words are being read, it makes the viewer understand that we are present as creators because we had a process of deciding. It doesn't matter our intention, but it shows that we were deciding how to use the technique. Yet, we have to remain absent as the subject or object of desire. And this usually happens to all of us. We're being used either through femininity or masculinity or nationality or race. Most, the art system wants our work to be a reflection of ourselves. I don't see your femininity in your work, or I see it clearly. Or I don't see your masculinity, or I see your masculine strokes. And this is something that we have to face as the legacy of history, but also as a fantasy that we always have to challenge. There is an impossibility for us to transfer any biological traits into our work. So we have to think about how to remain present as creators, but absent as the object or subject of desire. Questions, comments at this point? Okay, so then I just have a few more notes on that same reading. The scholar also talks about how science itself becomes a mode of producing a subject for specific political purposes. And it's also relevant to the times that we're living in today. Science itself becomes a mode of producing a subject for specific political purposes. And that's beyond the process of infection. That's beyond whether we believe the virus is real or not. It is how science produces this a subject of specific political purposes. Okay, so now we're going to connect these three readings to the imaginary orient. And this is a wonderful reading that has also many layers. It's very, very academic because it talks a lot about paintings, but it's very useful to understand artistic agency and also the fantasies that we create as artists. So what is this reading about?
Well, some of the things that this reading addresses is the work that one does as an artist becomes text when you put it out in the world. And so the painting, that's the subject, the main subject of this piece, as being created by someone who then creates this in quotations, truth about what the Orient is or this place. And so that responsibility of the artist in creating myth, creating story, it's beyond the artist's control at a certain point, when you put the text out into the world and then it can be read a certain way by the viewer.
Right. It is how we begin seeing clearly that place is intertwined with desire. And this is what the Orient is. It's an invention. It's not a geographical region. It's a fantasy. And it's a fantasy that is still being used in many ways. Thankfully, Dorothy Said wrote Orientalism, and then, which is also mentioned in the Nakedness of America, to understand how actual place is invented. And there's three absences. There are many more absences, but there are three absences that Linda Nochlin points to understand how, as artists, we have a responsibility in the process of making and creating images. What are these three absences that she talks about? And let's begin with any that you remember, and then also explain what does that mean? What is the meaning of these absences?
If I remember, I think the three absences would be like absence of time or history. So like time is standing still. The absence of artist. So removing themselves from the work. Specifically, is it Jerome? I don't know exactly how to pronounce that. And then the absence of art itself. So the depiction of reality, making this seem like it is exactly what we should be looking at.
Right, right. Let's begin with the first absence that also Daniela mentioned, history. What does that mean? When we say the absence of history, what would that mean?
There's no narrative.
Go ahead, Rusty.
Okay, there's no narrative. There's no anchor in. It's literally just a moment floating. There's nothing that happened before, nothing that's going to happen after. There's no line that it's on. It's just there.
Yes, Mariana, I think you're going to add something.
Yes, that it is timeless, that the process that is being represented is timeless, and it means that it is not changing over time, and it is related to with the idea of progress, that it means that it's not improving, it's not changing, it's the same.
Right, right. Jesse, you're going to say something.
The absence of history, which I think also ties into the absence of the artist, is that there's no acknowledgement of sorry, my notes. There's no acknowledgement of like the presence of it's like portraying the scene as something that is completely unaffected by anything external from the scene, and that also ties into the absence of the artist, because there's no presence of the colonial gaze. I mean, there's no acknowledgement of the colonial gaze, and no acknowledgement of the white man's effect on the scene.
Yes, yes, and this is how Sharon Holland talks about past as a place. How we imagine we can exist in a moment that are two different times. That past is a place, and somebody else, usually us, the tourist who's traveling or even who attends the museum, imagines that controls time. And we know it's impossible to exist in two times, at least today. We don't know in the future, but at least today, with what we know today, it is impossible to exist in two moments at the same time. And this also relates to what Jesse was saying, relates to the second absence, the absence of the artist. And who can elaborate? What does it mean, the absence of the artist? And this also relates to the quote that I just read about Imani Lewis. Lewis remains a presence that is absent in her work. She's present as an artist, as a creator of art, but she's absent as the subject or object of her art. So what does it mean to be absent as the artist? And this is, as Jesse was saying, it has to do with the gaze, it has to do with how we engage.
Well, I think, and it's been a process that is like circling my mind around a lot. It's the idea of, it has to do with the idea of objectifying someone, and it has to do because with the idea of representing an object instead of, even if in the picture or in the image of in the painting there is a person, we, by removing ourselves, we are not representing it as a person but as an object. So this idea of making it objects that we can control, it's the one that is like, by removing the artist or removing it, the meaning of the artist, we remove the Western from this idealization of the Orient. I don't know if I explained it like with the ideas that I wanted to say, but it has to do with this process of objectifying someone.
Yes, by removing the artist, the image is objectifying the rest. And this is an idea that is also connected to Europe and the Americas. By removing Europe, and this is one of the reasons I never use Western. In the next batch of readings, I will also include a reading on that. Because this is why Western is so dangerous. It's not a place, it's not a region, it's not a bunch of people. It doesn't exist because it can only exist in relation to the uncivilized, which is America. So America and Europe cannot be separated. They have to exist both as vicious places. So we have to destroy them as inventions, not in reality, but as inventions. Yes, Jesse, you're going to say something.
I just have a question. It might be a silly question, but I'm just curious as to how you how do you bring the artist in? I mean, besides like physically bringing the artist in, how do you? I mean, is this something that we should do in our own work? And how? I mean, there's this painting is kind of like a more extreme example of removing the artist because it really. Sorry, my cat is going crazy here because it really doesn't acknowledge at all the power relation between the artist and the subject. But how do you bring yourself into your work?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Let me take note on the reading that I will also give you. So first of all, as you're saying, the absence of the artist discloses that we have ways in which we drive audiences without their consent. We make them look, and it's similar to the thought that Denise had on the timeline. It sort of makes us think that it's transparent when in fact we're being driven by a way of seeing that is very specific. So how do we bring back the artist? How do we make ourselves present? It doesn't have to do with the idea of autobiography or self-portrait. It is in the technique. And as Lindsay was pointing at, thinking about, for instance, and I always think about distortion. How can we distort place and history? Because as Rusty was saying, the absence of a narrative, it's actually the narrative. So that's history. How do we distort? And I always think about take distortion as a technique. One of the examples that we see is paradox, the idea of the mirror, understanding that having inverse letters can make the viewer, the reader, aware that it's an ongoing process of reading. That makes us aware, and there are many other examples. And as we begin to get into the chapters of artistic agency, we will unpack what it means to be present as an artist, what it means to disclose that this is one perspective, it's not reality. And this relates to the third absence, the absence of art. Who could explain the idea of the absence of art? And this question is also related to the reading of The Nakedness of America.
Does this have to do with the concept of authenticity in these paintings, or?
As a byproduct, yes.
Okay,
as an effect, yes.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but is it like, for me, it was the insistence on the authenticity with unnecessary details, the repaired tile work, the Turkish tiles, which was a moral comment on the subject because it was repaired, which means it had been allowed to fall into disrepair, which means it's the Orient is corrupt and Western society is not, and so on. And so is that what we're kind of moving towards, or?
Yes,
Okay.
because that's and Lynn Maclain talks about the reality effect. I think it's Roland Barthes who she's using to understand that the more we're seduced by the idea of reality, once we see that it's an effect, it's something that is being put in place, that it's in place, that it's performing, the more we see it, the more we understand that it's made for that it's made to seduce. Mhm. So, how could we define the absence of art?
It's the absence of art. It's like making it. It's the depiction of reality. So a quote that I wrote down was seriousness of realism based on absence of any reminder that it's art. And I think they talked about it well by saying how like Delacroix's work was not well received because it perhaps had impassioned brushwork, outpouring perspective, and gave otherness to the subjects. Whereas in Jerome's work, there's no otherness. It's just a depiction of reality.
Right. Yes. It's imagining that art represents reality. And art never represents reality. Never. Never. In the worst cases, it's always a moral judgment on reality. Reality doesn't even exist. So it's usually the moral judgment on subjects or objects of desire. And that's, we see it through beauty, through aesthetics, through irony. So it's this idea, of course, art is inspired by our own reality, which is one perspective in an ocean of opinions and realities. So it is how we engage with art, imagining that is truth. And this is how we also finish the idea of intention. Intention will not remain. When we think about the snake charmer and Jerome, do we think that he wanted his painting to be an expression of racism or to be regarded as imperial propaganda? Probably not. Or maybe yes. But in the end, it doesn't matter how the painting behaves today. That's what matters. That's what artistic agency is. How the painting will mean different things as we think about them in relation to history. And remember that history will be rewritten and rewritten and rewritten over and over again. Questions, comments?
I just want to say, oh.
Sorry.
What do you want?
Want to go ahead? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
First Mariana, and then was it Daniela?
I think so.
Okay, go ahead, Mariana, and then we'll follow with the next question. Go ahead.
Yeah, now the only thing that I wanted to add is that this idea of the absence of art, it's also related to the idea of like scientific objectivity, quote, quote, and also how art is to represent what is universalized as a scientific knowledge. So art was also a tool to like spread this idea of universalism.
Yes, yes. There's no such thing as there's nothing universal. We don't know anything about the universe. We barely understand ourselves to even think about going beyond the solar system. So there's nothing universal. And also, let's keep in mind, and this also relates to the idea that Rusty introduced. There was a moment in history, in the official narrative, where science and art were together, produced by religion. So this is why, to us, it's very ridiculous. And it is today we don't think that way. And we have enshrined art and science both as in the same form as religion. Yes, and there was another question. Was it, I think it was Daniela? Because I couldn't see who was asking.
It was me.
Yes, go ahead.
Over here. Can you hear
hear me?
Yes. Oh, Lindsay?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in sort of linking a few of the readings together, but bringing in the idea of travel photography as well into the sort of this way of seeing and like spatialization of thought, because it's used. Well, I think it kind of extends from the way images of the Orient sort of first sort of came about, and then like I used to be a big fan of Steve McCurry's work before I kind of realized what it was endorsing. And when we kind of look at those images and the way that they're reinforced, because it's become a bit of a way of seeing other cultures and sort of repeated by others without us realizing sort of what the images are saying. And now it's kind of telling a specific narrative, and places have been created kind of through these narratives that we sort of reinforce every time images are created, and sort of linking that back to the reading that was talking about Instagram and filtering. And I think we can kind of all see the way that the narrative is becoming sort of stronger and stronger, actually, and it's kind of being used within marketing material and in the travel industry. And like an issue that I've seen sort of firsthand with that is, which you were talking about earlier, it sets expectations of place. And then when people do travel, you have a certain expectation because there's such a single and strong narrative often. And the negative of that is when the experience doesn't meet that expectation, it can create sort of incidents of racism sort of on the ground there. So there's like quite a big, serious and like evident impact of that work, I would say. And you see it a lot. People travel with great intentions, and I don't know, I think it's really interesting to kind of see the role that travel photography and is playing in the work, and that it's had an effect on photographers within like so I'm thinking of like India specifically, but you sort of see like the European gaze on India, and then photographers within that country are picking up on that same style and kind of reinforcing the same narrative. So I don't know, I was like exploring that idea a little bit. I wanted to bring that into the frame.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. Absolutely, because this is a technology that has been that is being perfected by everyone. And as we begin thinking about artistic agency, I will include other readings. There's a wonderful philosopher, Hannah Arendt, and she talks about the process of extermination that is actually rooted in the Cartesian ideal. That is, I'm connecting it to the reading on knowledge in westernized universities. All of you have read that reading before, and it talks about how the idea of I think, therefore I am, which connects with this notion of traveling as one single reality, as the experience of traveling as the individual perspective that becomes the truth. It's expressed in I think, therefore I am. And in that reading, we see that it's I conquer, therefore I am. And in fact, I exterminate, therefore I am. This is why, as Victoria is explaining, it's a technology that evolves. And so it's sort of ridiculous to think when we read the quote on Instagram that a legacy such as the production of these kinds of images would disappear. It cannot disappear. It would actually caught on with the legacy of history. And there will be many other new technologies that we don't know about that will be also rooted in these ideas because it's a technology that is being perfected. And that's how I brought Hannah Arendt into the conversation, because she says that when extermination has happened, there are many more chances for the process of extermination to be reenacted and happening again in the future, more than it actually had the chances to appear in that moment in history. Because first of all, we learned very fast, and second, because there has never been any kind of punishment that is so strong and so harsh that would deter anyone from committing these processes or engaging in these processes. And what is complicated is that images have been used as an excuse, as a form of expression of those processes. So to imagine that our artistic practice is exempt from that is impossible. This is why we need to re-examine how we think about history and place, first of all. How do we make our work not about history or place, and both, and also to think about distortion, to bring back the possibility of time and space when the viewer encounters our work. Questions, comments at this point?
Me. Can you hear me?
Yes. Adelante, Sayani.
Is okay. At the beginning, when we started talking about this reading, and you mentioned that Orientalism is just part of the imagination. I remember one experience that I have to explain once that be a Mexican is not a race. Is a so that's made me think about how and have relation with the other readings, how theories create also violence and justifies violence through image, authenticity, and romanticism. I don't know how do you say that.
Yeah, romanticism.
Yep, and how that is innocent without doubts through the technology. I don't know if it has sense. It's better.
Yes, it is. It is. That's the history of progress. That's how progress has been invented and reinvented. And as we move from those moments in, because if you think about it, we are unpacking the 16th century with its legacy and how it transformed itself through the 17th and 18th century, how that is connected to our experience today, how it is developing new technology, and all of these terms are full of problems. And as we enter the 19th century, we're going to begin understanding more why are we in the position we are today, and why the only solution, imaginable solution for the nation, for the nations in plural, was to force everyone to stay at home. Because that's the place, as an invention, in which ideology, this distortion of space and time, was able to rearrange everyone. So yes, it is a process that continues, and that it will find new ways to reorganize. I think at this point it's also exciting to think about other possibilities, not necessarily romanticizing that it's the end of a vicious era. It might be, but as we know, it's going to be worse. So we have to rethink our responsibility in that sense, and it brings back the ethical dimension of the work that we do. Because even if we're not exterminated by our work, somebody else will be exterminated by our work. So we have to be prepared by cracking the work, to allow to have an open-ended possibility as a question. And how we do that is to shift from statements into questions. Because what it's important, yes, thank you, Sayani. What it's important is to think about how our experience is valid. It's not the truth, but it's valid because this is the way in which we learn, understand, and also produce knowledge. So how do we extend that experience to someone else? And remember that every time we're teaching, for instance, as I'm explaining all these concepts, I'm learning more about myself than any of you. And of course, you're learning more about yourself than me or Nayeli, right? Or any of you. However, in the process of friction, that is knowledge that makes us not stay the same. And that's what allows change and the possibility of things to emerge differently. Hmm? Questions, comments? I think Victoria has a question. Yes, go ahead. A comment.
Hi. Yeah, I have a question for you and anybody else. I love the concepts and the way that you get my mind to work and all the readings that you send over. And I find it really easy to get lost in some of the broad ideas and very easy to lose my focus. And then I, as you know, from when I was on the residency, can feel sort of paralyzed in sort of where to go with actually creating work because there's just so much to think about and it's sort of where to start. And I was thinking about this a bit earlier when you were talking about like the Americas and Europe neither exist without the other. And immediately my mind kind of says, well, you could say that about anything. Like for two things to exist, there needs to be the opposite.
Right.
And so it's just kind of like there are so many spiraling thoughts that come out of everything. What are people doing to focus? Is kind of my question.
Well, I think the important aspect is to first of all to know that as artists, even if we make the problem worse because we make art, there's no other option. We're going to keep making work, and we need to continue. Whether we know how to or what to do or not, it doesn't matter. We have to keep going and keep producing because the reality is that the answer is not here, it's in the making. So for us to be present in the work, that means we have to produce the work. So the first thing that we all have to be pushed to do is to start making things. Even if we don't understand the direction, even if, and this is something I've learned from artists in residence, from each one of you who has, because, you know, at some point it makes us all cynical. Why does it even matter? The state of the world, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that what we're doing here today at this moment is very complex and very powerful. So I've learned that, and you all know that I don't believe in hope or faith or all of those things. However, one of the things that I have learned from you is that we are so committed that we choose these big questions for the rest of our lives, and we struggle with them. And even if we can't find the answer, we keep going and going and going. Not every artist, but most of the artists that we have in residence. And that sort of made me think I it's sort of renewing my hope in if and more than hope, I always turn it again into action because I don't believe in hope because hope makes us think and more than think feel that we're doing something where we're actually sitting doing nothing. And what we need to do is take action. So the first thing is we have to make. The second thing is also knowing that our experience is valid. No matter what professors have said, no matter what gallery owners have said, no matter what publishers have said, or museums, or any kind of institution, or even our parents sometimes, no matter whoever says about anything we do, it is very important to keep doing it because we're actually contesting history in a very profound way. So the empire in general, not the empire will try in general to figure out a way to make us stop. So first of all, you have to continue knowing that our experience is very valid just because it's the way we understand reality. Now, what we have to make a distinction between intuition and intention. Intuition is what is making us obsessed with something. And after my answer, I'm going to open the space for everyone to share how they do it. But it is this obsession that is leading us to something that we don't know what it is, but we sense it's there. And I usually identify that as knowledge. Sometimes it has to do with a conversation with a grandma. Sometimes it had to do with a conversation with someone else or a book or something that makes us obsessed with something and follow that path. what our intention is doesn't matter. So what we have to follow is intuition. And in that sense, think about of our own experience, not as a truth, but as an open-ended question. And this is why I always say that statements fail. If we proceed by thinking of a statement and then producing the work, it fails. That's not really how we work. Sometimes it's a phrase, sometimes it's a word. We go back to drawing, then photography. Then 2 years after, all of that made sense and we produce something. So it is knowing that we are exploring a question, an open-ended question. And I always suggest to make it as specific as possible. Not grandiose, humongous questions. Yes, our questions are rooted in that, but they have to be as specific as possible, thinking always in distorting place and history. So who else wants to share? Thank you, Victoria. That was a wonderful question.
Hi guys, it's Lindsay.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Lindsay.
Victoria, I can definitely relate to you. Sometimes I definitely do a lot of research in my own process, and I feel like at times I'm like, okay, I should be making now, and it's sometimes hard to make that transition. And something that I've personally been doing in my own practice, one thing is like just giving myself some sort of structure, whether it's just a drawing a day or something to get me making without any pressure. So like, a small 8x10 drawing or something. And once I do that, I'm like, wow, I did something. And then it feels easier to do the next thing that maybe, is closer to what I actually want to be exploring. And then in a kind of more philosophical sense, I guess what I try to do in my practice is just boil the ideas down to something that's so simple that it doesn't feel overwhelming anymore. So I guess what that means for me is like really sitting with the concepts and getting to what really is the root that I'm connecting to. And it's usually something pretty simple, and that feels more manageable to express than these really complicated, overwhelming ideas that we all have so much passion about, So that's just a little bit about what I do. I definitely struggle with it on a daily basis, but.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay. Absolutely, because one of the things we have to understand, two things. First of all, the scholars, sometimes they take too long to get to the point. Also, not everything in the readings is useful. It might not be useful today, it might be useful tomorrow, but it might not be useful at this point. So find key elements that could allow or have triggered something. The point is not to understand the whole text, because sometimes, it's a conversation. This is a perfect example to understand time and space. The scholar is not present physically, yet we're having a dialogue with their work. That's an encounter. And because it's a dialogue, it requires several conversations. So read it once, put it away, go back to it 2 months after or 3 years after. It doesn't matter when. Every time I go back to a text, I find new things, some things that are not useful, some things that I didn't understand before. And yes, as Lindsay is saying, the process of making and the process of reading, meaning the essays, is not connected, and it doesn't have to be connected. We're learning in two different ways. So it's not for you to stop making. It's to open a new avenue to begin exploring larger questions while making. Because knowing that you are identifying problems is already tackling the shadow that we've been talking about through the process of the residency for so many months. So, or weeks. It is tackling the shadow already just by thinking about the problem, even if you don't have a solution. Mm-hmm. Who else wants to share?
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay, because earlier I had I don't know what happened. I had my mic off or something. So one thing I wanted to mention about being productive is it's easy. It's for me, it's as easy as if I have an idea to write that idea down and then act on it. Like, I don't know how to explain that, but because we have a lot of ideas in our heads, and sometimes if you don't write them down, you forget about them. So if you write them down, you have like 5-second rule. If you have this idea, 5 seconds, find a piece of paper and write it down. And then this kind of helps like link whatever you're working on with other ideas and question those things that you like. I guess it works with your intuition. So the way I compare it is like lately I've been going to my garden, and I had this intuition this year because my lavender for the past 3 years was really depressed. My intuition was this year, just cut it. I read a lot of information about how if you cut too much of the lavender, it will not come back to life. And I was like, no, something's telling me I need to cut it. I need to like give it a good cutting. And I almost made it disappear, and it's coming back, and it's so beautiful. So I follow your intuition, I guess. I don't know.
Yes. And I can also suggest in that same train of thought, there are 3 aspects on how we make. One of them is form, the other one is material, and a third one is concept. So what you can also do is think of a question, take it as a challenge, and then you have to make 3 lists. The first one is form, the second one is material, and the third one is concept. And as Daniela is suggesting, think about, in terms of your intuition, about the concept and reduce it to 1 word. 1 word. My work is about time, or my work is about ABC, whatever it is. Make a list, because usually the work is it's tackling many concepts. So make a list of the concepts. It has to be 1 word. If it's a sentence, turn it into 1 word, the closest to the concept. And if it's not enough, that means that you have several concepts in that phrase. So break it down to these concepts, then use form. For instance, I'm obsessed with flowers. What kind of flowers? Violets or peonies or whatever it is. And break down the different forms. Form could be a chair, form could be a circle, form could be bread, form. And then material. Think about materials that you're obsessed with. I'm obsessed with indigo. I'm obsessed with fabric. I'm obsessed with, list all of the materials. And then cross them randomly. So now my challenge is to address my question, thinking about the concept of time, using the form flowers, and using as a material oranges. How can I make a work addressing my question in terms of time, oranges, and flowers? So I have to use oranges as the material, flowers as the form, and the concept is time. And that can break certain things. Not everything is useful. Not everything we make will actually make sense. But there's some findings in the process. Thank you, Daniela.
And
Go ahead.
I liked one other thing you said was about how you can put a text and read it and interpret it or feel something about it this time, and then put that text away because maybe it doesn't relate to what you're doing, and then years later or months later look at that text again. And so the way I approach almost everything I do is that when I go for a hike and I go for that same hike, I call it my backyard. It's just less than a kilometer away. Every time I go to that space, I see something different. I notice something different, even if it's the I've done it like 365 times this year. I see something different, and I take something back different from it. And so it inspires me in a different way every single time. The ability, I guess, is to be like to see things and to notice the details and to
Yes, it's a very good suggestion. What I do in a similar way is I keep notes on themes. And every time I read anything and I find something that triggers an idea of a theme, I go back to that file and then I copy that quote. and that helps me write essays or articles or work. It helps organize ideas, because there are concepts that takes years to distill them and for us to make something with it. Thank you, Daniela. Who else wants to share? Casey.
Yeah, it was really nice to hear you guys talk about that process of concept and form and technique. We mentioned it last week, and I tried to do some of it, but was still a little confused. But one thing that I would love to see, just because I'm inspired by all of you, is like I'd love to have a place on the classroom or something where someone can post the concept, the form, and the technique that they were working with, and then show what they came up with, just to see how different artists in this group kind of work through that process. Just a suggestion. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. What I will do today is I will upload, between today and tomorrow, I will upload the images that you all sent as some example of what you're exploring, and you can add questions to that yourself or others, to ask about techniques, to ask about what are the questions or the themes that you're exploring, how do you approach, and we're also going to begin unpacking artistic agency, to understand where could we go from here. Any other questions? Any other comments at this point?
Sorry, I actually had one more.
Sure, absolutely.
Sometimes it's hard for me to keep track of the conversations that are being held in the classroom. And I was just curious if you guys would be open to keeping those platforms that we already have, but then transferring it to another, maybe more conversation-friendly platform like Instagram. So the textiles group, the environment group, the printmaking group, all can have a conversation in Instagram as well as the classroom.
Absolutely. I think the classroom is a bit confusing because it's used for essays and assignments, but yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you want to create the groups. I think that would be useful. And I think there's an option to connect it with Arquetopia, or let me know and I can ask. Actually, Tonali might know more than I know, because I'm not that technological, but she can figure it out. So yes, absolutely. Let's move it into a space that conversations can flow in different directions. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other comments?
Yes.
Yes, Camila, and then Justin. Yes.
Last week, somebody brought up the idea of having like meetings either on Zoom or Google Hangout with the groups. And I think like talking in person for me is more helpful than like chatting a lot of the time, or not in person, I guess video, whatever. This is as close to in person as we're gonna get. Yeah, so I wonder if there's like a way to make a poll for times to meet or something like that. Yeah, I'm not sure what ideas people have.
Yes, I don't know if maybe Instagram will allow to arrange meetings faster. And I'm happy. I'm going to also ask Tonali to figure out if there's a way to organize the meetings through Zoom or the classroom setting or the Google Meet, so that we can facilitate that. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's also useful to record them because there are many questions and comments that cannot be written down while we are. So I think Google Meet would be ideal, but I'll ask Tonali because she will know more than I do. But yes, we should figure that out this week. Yes. Yes, Rusty. I think Rusty had a question.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment. I just want to share some good news. One of the short stories that I uploaded as one of my works is actually got published on a brand new online journal.
Wonderful.
Felicidades.
Muchas felicidades. Congratulations. Yes.
Yeah. So you might be able to read it at Arquetopia or at that journal, whichever place. Awesome.
And I think that's wonderful to bring it up, because any good news that we can share, we should start sharing them. I see a lot of wonderful projects being born in this space. So anything that you want to share, because there might be a possibility of finding new open calls or opportunities or anything that you want to share that is good news, please bring it up in the meetings. It's in the classroom and the spaces, because we should all promote each other and support each other. There's also a wonderful idea that Tonali has, and it has to do with featuring each one of you. And I'm going to ask Tonali then to also share her idea.
¿Me escuchan bien?
Sí, muy bien.
Well, some of you wrote me to participate in making a video for Instagram. So what we want to do, it's an open studio. So for each one of you or whoever who wants to participate, and this consists in making a short video for showing your studio or also the projects that you are currently working on. And also you can share these activities that you shared before, like Daniela and Lindsay, I think, about your creation process. So this is the idea that we want to share with you. And if you want to participate, I will send you an email with the guide points for the video. And we will, also I need to research for these meetings that you want to do for a specific group. So we can, I don't know who wants to participate. I send you the email. And what I also want to know, what do you think about this open studio?
Yes, one of the important things, thank you, Tonali. One of the important aspects that we have to consider when we think about place and space and history and time, space, history, place, is that how we create in relation to intuition has to do with process. So one of the ideas, this idea that Tonali has, connects with these ideas about understanding that our work is not the image, it's actually the process. And there's so much to share in process that we cannot share in the image, that this initiative that she has is precisely to open a little bit more of how we make things. So think about process, think about space, think about this possibility, this creative possibility. It could be a tutorial of something very simple. It doesn't have to be very complex. It could be, how you show your space and where you do what, but emphasize process. How do we make? How are we making? Any additional, thank you, Tonali. Any additional comments, questions at this point?
Hi, yeah, I have a few things. One being, I am planning to do a workshop over my Instagram this weekend. So you're all invited if you want to do that. I can type the information in the chat when I'm done talking.
Yes, please.
And it's just collage based. So pretty simple. But then I have another question. Something I've been thinking about with my work, I'm realizing is that I'm trying to approach themes from opposites. So for example, looking at work that I do and seeing that it looks outwardly very optimistic. So trying to add elements that are the converse of that. I'm just curious what you might think about that technique, because I know when you're talking about form, material, concept, boiling it down to one word, but then I'm also trying to inject opposites. And then we talk a lot about opposites today. One thing can't exist without the other. And I mean, the reason why I think about it is because some of my work, some of the questions I have relate to my experience with bipolar disorder, which is having, the ups and the downs. And I feel frustrated sometimes when people think it's just one, but there's oftentimes these gray areas and weirdness. So I've been trying to make work that isn't just one or the other, that there's middle ground. But again, like, it's all an attempt. Who knows if it's actually working out? So anyway, I kind of wanted to pose that as maybe a topic for some comments or discussion.
Yes. It is very useful because the real question, the question that is very profound, it's that grayness. Opposites do not exist. They don't even exist in relation to each other. They are inventions. We want them to exist because it gives us a position in relation to power. Mhm. What really exists is that whole shading, all those grades of gray. So we need to think about that. How is that non-existing opposites hiding the reality, and what is the reality that they are hiding? And this goes back to the question of how do we perform, and not only that, who are we performing for? So when you address that in the work, think about who are you performing for? And how these two opposites do not exist. So it's not about how we represent the opposites, it's how you disclose the gray that is usually not seen, that is usually absent. Or it's actually hiding. It's not necessarily absent, but it's being hidden. Yes. And I will see, I think in the next batch of readings, I will include an essay by Kirsten Buick that talks about the public self and the private self as also the invention of two opposites that regulate each other. And they have the purpose of regulating each other in relation to power.
Paco, I have a question about this idea about form, concept, and material.
Yeah.
Is there room in material for technique? Because as I start thinking about like the different techniques that I'm learning and working with right now, some of them might be, the actual technique might be more important than the material.
Yes, they go together. Okay. I think it should be material / technique, but it can be as abstract as printmaking. For instance, if you're going to use printmaking, it has to be about specific material because each material has a history. Each material functions performing meaning as part of language. So it have to be very specific. So yes, the purpose of thinking about material has to do with technique, but it's also made so that we don't only think about technique thinking that we resolved it. So that, for instance, if you're using silk to print, is different than using paper. And if you're using cotton paper, is different than other kind of paper, Japanese paper, whatever it is. So it has the function to be as specific as possible. So yes, I would begin thinking about material with technique.
Okay.
Wonderful. So any last questions, because we're running out of time?
I just had something. Earlier today, you mentioned 2 articles. One was about the experience of seeing the David in Las Vegas and how she preferred that. And the other one was about the awful Eat, Pray, Love book.
Yes.
Would you be willing to share those articles with all of us? Because I'd love to read them.
Absolutely. I have the introduction to the book, which is on the legacy of the Grand Tour. And I'm trying to find the PDF of that reading. And I will try to post it. So I will include the introduction. The introduction to the book is not that exciting, but it mentions those 2 articles because it's fascinating. So I will include those two, and I will put them in the additional bibliography section. Absolutely.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
absolutely. Any other readings that you're interested in? Voice?
Yes.
Yes. Maria.
I wonder if you have any readings about handicraft and art, because there is like this difference between what is art and what is considered a handicraft. So I during this process I've been thinking about this chart that you told us to do about using a matte paper for the work that I want to do, and how I am trying to research about how a matte paper started, like the process of creating paper from that tree. But it is considered a handicraft, even if you buy the paper, like the foils of paper, it is considered a handicraft. So I wonder if you have any like readings about that, like how do we I mean, I know that usually it is considered art when someone that is considered art uses it, but how this distortion between the different, like it's related to this process.
Yes. Uh, First of all, nothing is considered and nothing is not considered. Nothing has a stable meaning. It depends on the context. But yes, what is fascinating and relevant about the question that you're asking goes in two directions. First of all, a matte paper is considered or could be considered craft or folk art or all of that because the technology of paper is very important. So trying, no, acknowledging the technology of paper in the Americas puts Europe into question. This is why a matte paper is not considered part of the technology of paper. And we have to think about paper as just as we think about the internet. It was a moment in history where the technology transformed everything, absolutely everything. The possibility of keeping ideas in a transportable way, in a way that was easy or easier to access, and then eventually where the technology of printing it gets disseminated, is very important. So to think about a matte paper in connection to that is to separate it from the tradition that Europe claims invented. And the second part of the question is folk art in relation to art, and there's a wonderful reading on the trouble with the term art, and also I'll find other readings that talk about folk art or craft or all these ideas because it is a class distortion. It is, again, putting back through gender, through class, putting individuals into place as opposed to recognizing space. So it's the idea, is how we make, and specifically in terms of Mexico, it is something that it's invented in the 20th century by modernist artists to frame the idea of modern art in relation to other arts, and it's only class based. So I will find readings on that, and I will also add them to the additional bibliography section. Thanks for the question. So thank you all. It's been wonderful to have you again and to see you all. It is it's a very productive process, and it's always it creates a lot of synergy, and it makes me very excited because we are actually pushing in similar directions with different possibilities of making. So thank you all. We're going to look into the possibility of meetings and creating these groups in platforms outside of the classroom chapter. Tonali, do you have something to add? No? Okay. And I will upload new readings. I will also add the date for the meeting. The date in which the readings are due is actually the date of the meeting. I think next week is going to be Friday. Friday.
May 8th. And
Friday.
it will be the last one.
Friday, May 8th is the last one. So let's be prepared for that and activate the groups, because the residency doesn't depend on me or Nayeli or both, or it's not only us, it's all of you. So let's extend this as much as possible. There are new opportunities coming up also for discussions and that are virtual that I will keep you posted on, so stay tuned. And thank you again for everything. I will upload everything in the classroom, and we'll go from there. So see you next week. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Adios.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.